My name is Bethany. I'm 27 years old and I slid a scratched debit card across the cold marble surface because I desperately needed the money on it. The teller glanced down at my worn-out coat with obvious disgust as she prepared to swipe the piece of plastic I had ignored for 5 long years. I only wanted to withdraw the exact $1,000 inside to cover my urgent medical bills before the hospital stopped my treatment. But the humiliation I felt in that moment was nothing compared to the day my life shattered 5 years ago inside our family estate. The living room air was thick with the scent of funeral lilies as the family attorney read the final will of my late parents. I sat in silence while he announced that the entire portfolio of properties would go to my older sister. She didn't even wait for him to finish before snatching the small envelope with my name on it. My sister tore it open, revealing a single debit card, then threw it straight at my face with pure disgust in her eyes. She screamed that Mom and Dad only felt sorry for me because I was just the adopted one. Without a shred of mercy, she pointed at the door and told me to take the $1,000 as my final payment and get out of her house immediately. I was thrown into the freezing night with nothing but that piece of plastic. Back in the present, the teller swiped the card, and her expression suddenly changed from arrogance to absolute terror as she leaned closer and whispered one sentence that left me frozen in shock. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to see what the teller whispered and how this discovery ruined my sister's life forever. Back to 5 years ago, right after my parents' funeral. Everything happened so fast that I still could not believe it was real, as my parents were gone, taken suddenly in a horrific accident after a massive fire broke out at their factory. Just days earlier, they were still alive and calling my name in that gentle, familiar voice, but then everything disappeared in a single devastating instant. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me with a finality that marked the end of my life as a daughter of the Sterling family. I turned away from the warmth of the foyer and stepped straight into the biting wind of a Chicago blizzard that was burying the city under layers of ice and snow. My thin black dress was useless in the sub-zero cold as the snow soaked through the fabric and seeped into my bones, chilling me to the very marrow. I wandered down the long driveway in a daze while my teeth chattered uncontrollably and my vision blurred by tears that froze against my cheeks. The physical cold was agonizing, but it was nothing compared to the icy truth settling in my chest that the people who swore they would love me had thrown me away like trash. I trudged through the growing snowdrifts for blocks, with no coat and no luggage, because my older sister Valerie didn't even give me the right to pack a bag before she kicked me out. I knew I wouldn't survive the night outside without shelter, so my trembling fingers fumbled for my phone and dialed the only number I knew would answer this late. My best friend Sarah picked up on the second ring and told me to come over immediately without asking a single difficult question. That night, I curled up on her lumpy beige couch in her tiny apartment while listening to the wind scream against the window like a mourning ghost. Sarah brought me a blanket and a cup of hot coffee, while I stared blankly at the empty wall because I was too shocked to speak about the betrayal I had just survived. Her place was cramped and smelled faintly of laundry detergent, but it offered the safety my childhood home no longer did. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for her silence because even one word of comfort would have shattered the fragile composure I was desperately trying to hold together. The next morning brought a harsh reality as I emptied my pockets onto Sarah's coffee table to see what I had left. The only thing of value I owned was the scratched debit card Valerie had thrown in my face the night before like garbage. I picked it up, and a surge of burning anger rose inside me which momentarily overpowered the grief crushing my chest. I bent the card until the center turned white, because I wanted nothing more than to snap it in half and toss the pieces into the trash. Accepting that money felt like accepting their insult, and admitting I really was just an adopted child who deserved only pity. I hesitated for a long time before I slowly released my grip and slid the card deep into the back of my wallet. I decided to keep it not for the money, but as physical proof of the cruelty I had just escaped. I moved out of Sarah's apartment a week later because I refused to be a burden to anyone ever again. The following 5 years transformed me from a sheltered daughter into a woman forged by exhaustion and grit. I took a job at a rundown diner on the South Side called the Rusty Spoon, where the air always smelled of burnt grease and stale coffee. My days became a relentless cycle of double shifts and sleepless nights as I waited tables for rude customers who tipped in loose change. I scrubbed dirty floors until my knees were bruised and washed mountains of greasy dishes until my hands were raw and blistered. Every dollar I earned went directly toward paying off my student loans and rent for a basement apartment that flooded every time it rained. I learned to survive on the discarded food from the restaurant kitchen and stitched my own clothes to save money rather than asking for help. While I was counting pennies to afford a simple meal of instant noodles, rumors of my former family drifted back to me through old acquaintances. I heard that Valerie and my brother-in-law Derek were living a life of absolute excess within the walls of my childhood home. People whispered about the extravagant parties they hosted where champagne flowed like water, and guests danced on the expensive furniture my mother had cherished. Derek reportedly bought a new sports car every 6 months and parked them in the driveway I used to shovel during the winters. They were burning through the family fortune with a reckless arrogance that suggested the money would never run out. I forced myself to ignore their happiness and focused entirely on my own survival in the shadows of the city. The naive girl who begged for acceptance at the funeral had died in the snow that night, leaving behind a woman who trusted no one. 5 years later, on a freezing Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, the fragile stability I had built for myself finally collapsed under the weight of a single unfortunate accident. I had severely scalded my arm while carrying a pot of boiling soup during a busy lunch shift at the diner, which resulted in second-degree burns that required immediate medical attention. The doctor ordered me to stay home for at least 2 weeks to prevent infection, but my manager bluntly informed me that if I did not work, then I would not get paid a single cent. The loss of 2 weeks' wages was a catastrophic blow because I lived paycheck to paycheck with absolutely no savings to cushion the fall. My landlord had already slid a bright red eviction notice under my door that morning, and the pharmacy was demanding payment for the burn cream and antibiotics I desperately needed. I sat on the edge of my mattress while clutching my throbbing arm and realized with a sinking heart that I had completely run out of options. The only lifeline I had left in this world was the scratched piece of plastic I had hidden in my wallet for 5 years. Using the money Valerie had thrown at me felt like an admission of defeat, because it proved that she was right about me being a charity case who could not survive on her own. However, the gnawing pain in my arm and the terrifying prospect of sleeping on the snowy streets forced me to swallow my pride. I put on my threadbare coat to cover my bandaged arm and walked 10 blocks to the nearest branch of Liberty Trust Bank, with my head hung low in shame. The bank lobby was intimidatingly warm and smelled of expensive cologne, which stood in sharp contrast to the stale odor of grease that clung to my own clothes. I waited in the long line while trying to ignore the judgmental stares from the businessmen in tailored suits who stepped away from me as if poverty were contagious. When I finally reached the front of the line, I approached the marble counter where a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a stiff uniform was waiting. She looked me up and down with an expression of undisguised distaste before her eyes landed on the battered card I placed on the glass surface. The plastic was worn white at the edges and bent in the middle from the night I almost snapped it in half 5 years ago. She picked it up delicately with the tips of her fingers as if it were a piece of dirty trash that might soil her pristine hands. She did not even try to hide her skepticism as she flipped the card over to check the signature before looking back at me with a smirk. "Are you sure this card is still active? It looks like it belongs in the trash." I felt my face burn with humiliation, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact because I had no energy left to fight for my dignity. "Just check the balance, please. I really need that money today." The teller rolled her eyes and let out an audible sigh of annoyance before she slowly slid the card through the card reader on her computer. I held my breath and mentally prepared myself to withdraw every cent of the $1,000 so I could pay my landlord and never step foot in this place again. I expected the machine to beep once and display the meager balance, but instead a loud and piercing alarm suddenly shattered the quiet atmosphere of the bank. It was not the simple sound of a declined transaction, but a continuous high-pitched siren that signaled a major security breach or a critical system error. Every single person in the lobby stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at me, while the security guards near the entrance placed their hands on their holsters. I stood frozen in terror because I immediately assumed that Valerie must have reported the card stolen years ago to set me up for a crime I did not commit. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited for the police to come and drag me away in handcuffs. However, the reaction of the teller was even more alarming than the noise itself because her face had drained of all color. Her hands were shaking violently as she stared at the computer screen, which was flashing a bright, ominous red light that illuminated her pale features. She looked at me, not with disgust anymore, but with a sudden and overwhelming fear that I could not understand. She fumbled for the internal telephone on her desk and dialed a number with trembling fingers while keeping her eyes fixed on me as if I were a ghost. "Mr. Manager, please come to counter 5 immediately. We have a code red on a priority trust card." "Yes, the holder is right here." Moments later, inside the bank's luxurious VIP meeting room, the atmosphere shifted from panic to an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. I sat on a plush leather sofa that cost more than my entire year's rent while holding a porcelain cup of tea that I was too terrified to drink. The branch manager paced back and forth in front of me while wiping beads of sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He looked nothing like the arrogant man who usually ran this establishment because he was currently trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. He placed the battered debit card on the polished mahogany table between us, as if it were a fragile artifact of immense power. I stared at the scratched plastic and wondered if I was about to be arrested for fraud, because I still believed there was only $1,000 on it. The manager finally stopped pacing and took a deep breath to steady his shaking voice before he looked me directly in the eyes. "Ms. Bethany, I apologize for the confusion. This isn't a debit card. It is the master key to the Sterling Family Trust Fund established 5 years ago." I blinked in confusion because the words he spoke sounded like a foreign language to my exhausted mind. I tried to ask him what he meant, but my throat was so dry that no sound came out. The manager opened a leather folder he had brought with him and turned it around so I could see the figures printed on the page. He pointed to the bottom line where a string of numbers stretched across the paper. He announced in a solemn tone that the current balance in the account was $5 million. I felt the blood drain from my face as the room began to spin around me. He explained that this money came from my parents' massive life insurance policy, which carried a double indemnity clause for accidental death. Over the last 5 years, the principal amount had been aggressively invested in high-yield stocks and bonds, which allowed the interest to compound exponentially. I sat there frozen while my mind struggled to reconcile the two realities that were crashing into each other. I had been starving for 5 years to save a few dollars for a meal, while $5 million sat in my wallet the entire time. I had humiliated myself scrubbing toilets and serving rude customers while I was secretly a multimillionaire. The irony was so bitter that I wanted to laugh and scream at the same time. Before I could process this revelation, the heavy wooden door to the VIP room creaked open slowly. A figure I had not seen since the day of the funeral stepped into the room, carrying a thick leather briefcase that looked heavy with secrets. The family attorney, Mr. Whitaker, looked older than I remembered, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines etched around his sad eyes. He nodded solemnly to the bank manager, who quickly excused himself to give us privacy. Mr. Whitaker sat down opposite me and placed a thick stack of sealed envelopes on the table next to the card. He looked at me with a gaze full of pity and sadness that made my stomach churn with anxiety. I remembered him standing in the corner of the living room while Valerie threw me out, and I had hated him for his silence that night. He placed his hand on the files and pushed them gently toward me. "Your parents knew this day would come, Bethany. They made me promise not to approach you until you activated the card yourself. Read this. It explains everything." I took the envelope from his hand and felt my heart stop when I recognized the familiar slant of my mother's handwriting on the front. My fingers trembled so violently that I almost dropped the letter as a wave of nausea washed over me. I ripped open the seal and unfolded the paper to see the words that had been written by ghosts 5 years ago. The letter confirmed everything the bank manager had said and stated clearly that I was the sole beneficiary of their entire liquid estate. The shock quickly morphed into a hot and blinding rage that burned through my veins like fire. I thought about the nights I slept on the floor and the days I went hungry because I had no money for food. I thought about the humiliation of scrubbing toilets while Valerie lived like a queen in our home. I looked up at Mr. Whitaker through a blur of angry tears because I could not understand why they would subject me to such torture. This felt less like a gift and more like a cruel game they had played with my life. 20 minutes later, sitting alone with the iPad Mr. Whitaker provided, I stared at the blank screen with trembling hands before finally finding the courage to press play. The screen flickered to life, revealing the faces of my parents sitting side by side on the familiar beige sofa in our old living room. They looked incredibly weary, and their faces were etched with deep lines of exhaustion that I had never noticed when I was younger. My father cleared his throat nervously while my mother reached out to squeeze his hand for support, as if they were preparing to deliver the worst news imaginable. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of overwhelming love and a terrified anxiety that pierced straight through the hardened shell I had built around my heart. My father began to speak in a grave tone that commanded attention as he explained the nightmare they had been living in secret during their final months. He revealed that they had discovered Valerie had amassed enormous gambling debts that were spiraling completely out of control. She had secretly leveraged her own future inheritance to borrow money from dangerous loan sharks who were beginning to threaten the safety of the entire family. They realized that Valerie was planning to seize control of their assets immediately to pay off her creditors, which would have left me with absolutely nothing. He paused to wipe a tear from his eye before looking directly into the camera lens with intense seriousness. "We found out about Valerie's debts, honey. If we left you any money openly, she would have sued you, harassed you, or worse to get it. We couldn't let that happen." The video continued to explain that they had to devise a desperate strategy to ensure my long-term survival, even if it meant breaking my heart in the short term. They decided to leave the family estate to Valerie as a massive decoy because it was the most visible asset she coveted. They knew her greed would make her focus entirely on the house and the lifestyle it provided while ignoring the seemingly insignificant pittance left to me. If they had split the money evenly or given me a share, Valerie would have dragged me into endless lawsuits or physically threatened me until I handed it over. The debit card with the $1,000 was designed to look like a final insult to make me leave quickly so I would be far out of Valerie's reach when her creditors came calling. My mother then leaned closer to the camera with tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she explained the mechanism behind the trust fund. They had secretly transferred all their liquid assets into the fund and locked it with a strict 5-year maturity clause. They calculated that it would take exactly 5 years for Valerie to burn through the value of the house and destroy herself financially. They wanted to ensure that by the time I received this money, Valerie would be powerless and unable to hurt me. She reached out and touched the screen as if she were trying to stroke my hair through the digital divide. "We had to be cruel to be kind. We needed you to be away from her safe and independent. Please forgive us for hurting you, my reckless little girl." The screen faded to black, leaving me alone in the silent room with the crushing weight of their sacrifice pressing down on my chest. I clutched the cold device against my heart and curled forward as a guttural sob ripped through my throat. For 5 years, I had cursed their names and believed they viewed me as a second-class citizen because I was adopted. I realized with a sickening jolt that I had been wrong about every single thing since the day of the funeral. They had not banished me because they didn't love me, but rather they sent me away because they loved me enough to play the villains in my story. They accepted my hatred and died with me thinking they were cruel, just to ensure I would be standing here today as a millionaire. The pain of my previous poverty vanished instantly, only to be replaced by a profound and aching gratitude for the parents I had lost. "I forgive you," I whispered into the silence of the room. "I forgive you for everything." While I was sitting in the plush safety of the bank's VIP room, absorbing the life-changing truth my parents had left me, Mr. Whitaker laid out the grim reality of what was happening across town at my childhood home. He had been monitoring the estate closely as the executor of the trust, and he informed me that the bank had just served the final foreclosure notice that morning. I later learned that the atmosphere inside the mansion had descended into absolute chaos the moment the sheriff posted the eviction warning on the front door. Valerie and Derek were reportedly spiraling into a panic because they had refinanced the paid-off home 3 times to fund a lavish lifestyle and a guaranteed cryptocurrency investment that had crashed to zero overnight. The walls that once held the laughter of my parents now echoed with the shrill screams of a marriage collapsing under the weight of financial ruin. According to the neighbors who overheard the commotion, the argument between them was explosive. Derek had apparently stopped pacing to point a trembling finger at my sister, his eyes bulging with accusation. "They are coming to kick us out tomorrow. Valerie, I told you not to bet everything on that crypto scheme." Valerie, never one to accept responsibility for her failures, threw a vase against the wall before shrieking back at him with equal venom. "Shut up, Derek. It was your idea to refinance the house in the first place." Hearing about their misery sparked a feeling in me that I hadn't felt in years: justice. I left the bank with a heavy advance on my inheritance and immediately set out to erase the physical evidence of my poverty. The first thing I did was march into the hospital billing department and pay off my outstanding medical bills in full, feeling a surge of incredible power as I watched the balance hit zero. I then walked into a high-end boutique downtown, the kind of place I used to be afraid to even look at through the window. I purchased a tailored black wool coat, a sophisticated dress, and leather boots that actually kept the cold out. I looked in the dressing room mirror and saw a woman who was no longer a victim, but a force to be reckoned with. The fear that had haunted my eyes for 5 years was replaced by a steely determination to finish what my parents had started. Mr. Whitaker met me at a quiet cafe later that afternoon to discuss the final phase of my parents' plan regarding the family estate. He placed a thick file on the table and informed me that due to Valerie's non-compliance and the sheer scale of her debt, the bank had expedited the process. "The house is scheduled to be sold at a blind emergency auction tomorrow morning," Mr. Whitaker explained, tapping the document. "This is the only opportunity to secure the property before it goes on the open market." I looked at the lawyer with a steely determination, my heart pounding with the anticipation of reclaiming the sanctuary that had been stolen from me by greed and malice. I realized that this was not just about buying a house. It was about taking back my history and my dignity. "Buy it back, Mr. Whitaker," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I authorize you to place the highest bid through a shell company. I don't care what the price is, just make sure I am the owner by noon tomorrow. If we bid anonymously, they won't know it's you until the deed is signed." "Is that your intention?" he asked, pen hovering over the paper. "Exactly," I replied as I signed my name with a steady hand. "I want to see the look on her face when she realizes who really owns the roof over her head. Keep my identity a secret until the very last second." While I was securing my future, Mr. Whitaker told me that Valerie was spending her final hours in the house, frantically trying to find a lifeline. She had spent the afternoon calling every contact in her phone, old college friends, distant cousins, and even the business partners she had previously insulted. She begged and pleaded for a loan to save the house, but word of her massive gambling debts had spread throughout the city. One by one, they rejected her pleas because everyone knew she was drowning and had burned every bridge she ever crossed. She even tried calling our wealthy aunt, who simply laughed and reminded Valerie of how she had treated me at the funeral 5 years ago. Valerie ended the call in tears, slumping onto the floor amidst the boxes she was too proud to pack, finally realizing that she was about to experience a destitution far worse than anything she had forced upon me. 1 week later, the peaceful suburban street of my childhood was transformed into a chaotic spectacle of flashing lights and shouting voices. I watched the scene unfold from the back seat of a tinted black sedan parked just down the block, where no one would notice my arrival. 2 sheriff's cruisers were parked haphazardly on the lawn, while a moving truck commissioned by the bank waited idly in the street to clear out the furniture. The front door of the estate was wide open as uniformed officers tried to reason with the hysterical couple barricaded inside the foyer. I could hear Valerie screaming obscenities at the top of her lungs, claiming that she had rights and that they were trespassing on private property. It was a pathetic display of entitlement from a woman who had ignored every legal notice sent to her over the past 6 months. I signaled to my driver to pull forward slowly until we were positioned directly in front of the wrought iron gates that I used to open manually when I lived here. The car came to a smooth stop, and I took a deep breath to steady the adrenaline coursing through my veins before opening the door. I stepped out onto the pavement wearing the tailored wool coat I had purchased with my inheritance and a pair of oversized designer sunglasses that completely concealed my eyes. The sound of my leather boots clicking rhythmically against the asphalt cut through the noise of the argument like a metronome counting down to their destruction. I walked past the stunned moving crew and the weary police officers who were relieved to see someone who looked like they had authority over the situation. Valerie finally stormed out onto the porch with her hair in wild disarray and her face blotchy from hours of crying and screaming at the law enforcement agents. She looked nothing like the polished socialite she pretended to be as she frantically waved a crumpled piece of paper at the officers. She spotted me standing near the bottom of the steps, but she did not recognize her own sister beneath the expensive clothes and confident posture. She assumed I was another representative sent by the bank to humiliate her further during her lowest moment. She marched down the steps with aggressive strides and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face while her voice cracked with rage. "Who are you? Did the bank send you here to mock me? Get off my property right now." I did not flinch or step back as she invaded my personal space because I was no longer the frightened girl she had bullied for decades. I reached up slowly with gloved hands to remove my sunglasses and locked eyes with the woman who had ruined my life 5 years ago. The recognition hit her like a physical blow to the stomach, causing the color to drain instantly from her face. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish out of water as her brain struggled to process the impossibility standing before her. Derek stumbled out of the house behind her carrying a box of electronics, which he dropped onto the concrete with a loud crash when he realized who was standing in their driveway. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating until Mr. Whitaker stepped forward from behind the police officers, holding the deed in his hand. He cleared his throat and announced in a loud and clear voice that the property had been sold at a blind auction that morning. He gestured respectfully toward me and stated that Ms. Bethany Sterling was the sole legal owner of the estate effective immediately. The revelation seemed to suck the air out of the lungs of everyone present as the power dynamic shifted violently in my favor. Derek was the first to recover from the shock as his survival instincts kicked in and overrode any sense of loyalty he had toward his wife. He looked at Valerie with sudden disgust and then scrambled toward me with a pathetic smile plastered on his face. He started babbling rapidly about how he always liked me, and that everything was Valerie's fault because she controlled the finances. He tried to reach out to touch my arm while claiming he was a victim of her manipulation, but I stepped back to let him grasp only empty air. It was sickening to watch him throw his wife under the bus so quickly just to save his own skin. Valerie stared at her husband in disbelief before turning her desperate and terrified gaze back to me. The arrogance that had defined her existence evaporated instantly, leaving behind a broken woman who realized she had lost absolutely everything. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the dirty driveway and reached out to grab the hem of my coat with shaking hands. She started sobbing uncontrollably while trying to evoke the family bond she had severed with a pair of scissors years ago. "Bethany, please. We are sisters. Blood is thicker than water, right? You can't let your own sister live on the streets." Standing firmly on the porch of my childhood home, I looked down at them with an expression that held no trace of the sympathy Valerie was desperately trying to evoke. She continued to sob about our shared history and the sanctity of family bonds while clutching the hem of my coat with her trembling fingers. I reached into my pocket to retrieve my smartphone, where Mr. Whitaker had uploaded a very specific file from the estate's security archives just that morning. I tapped the screen to play the footage and turned the device around so Valerie and Derek could see the grainy black and white video clearly. The recording showed a younger Valerie standing in this exact doorway 5 years ago while throwing my meager possessions into the snow and screaming hateful slurs at a terrified girl. The audio was crisp enough to hear her voice shouting that I was nothing but a genetic mistake who deserved to freeze to death. Valerie stopped crying instantly as she watched her own cruelty play out on the small screen in agonizing detail. She looked up at me with terror in her eyes because she realized that I had not forgotten a single second of that night. I put the phone away slowly and took a step closer to her until I was looming over her kneeling form like a judge delivering a final verdict. I looked straight into her tear-filled eyes and repeated the very words she had used to destroy my soul half a decade ago. "You told me that night that I was a stranger to this family and that I did not belong here. You said that blood is thicker than water, and since I was adopted, I was nothing to you. Well, Valerie, I am respecting your wishes because I am going to treat you exactly like a stranger." I turned to the head of the private security team I had hired to accompany Mr. Whitaker and gave a sharp nod toward the gate. "Remove these trespassers from my property immediately and ensure they never set foot on this street again." 2 burly guards stepped forward and grabbed Valerie and Derek by their arms to haul them away from the porch. Derek started screaming that he was innocent and begged me to just give him a small loan to get back on his feet. Valerie screamed my name in a high-pitched wail of despair as she was dragged down the driveway she had once walked with such arrogance. I watched without flinching until they were tossed outside the wrought iron gates, which were then slammed shut and locked with a heavy metallic clang. They were left standing on the curb with nothing but the clothes on their backs to face the mountains of debt and legal consequences waiting for them. The crowd of neighbors and police officers slowly dispersed, leaving me alone in the silence of the large estate. I turned around and walked through the open front door into the foyer where the air was still thick with the tension of the confrontation. I walked past the living room where the furniture was draped in dust sheets and climbed the grand staircase toward the second floor. I did not stop until I reached the master bedroom at the end of the hall where my parents had spent their final years. I pushed the door open gently and was greeted by the faint scent of my mother's lavender perfume, which still lingered in the fabric of the curtains. I walked over to the large 4-poster bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress where they used to read bedtime stories to me when I was a child. The silence here was not empty, but rather filled with a comforting warmth that felt like a spectral embrace from the 2 people who loved me most. I ran my hand over the soft duvet and closed my eyes to imagine them sitting beside me one last time. "Thank you," I whispered into the quiet room, while tears of gratitude finally spilled down my cheeks. Thank you for being the villain so I could be the hero of my own life. I promise to make you proud. I made a vow right there in their bedroom to use this fortune not for vanity, but to create a legacy of kindness. I would establish a foundation in their names, dedicated to providing scholarships and safe housing for adopted children and orphans who had been abused or abandoned. I would turn the pain of my past into a shield for those who could not protect themselves. Lessons from this story. Blood does not define family. The people who share your DNA can be your worst enemies, while those who choose to love you are your true family. My parents proved that their love for their adopted daughter was stronger than any biological tie, while my sister proved that shared blood is no guarantee of loyalty or kindness. Greed is a bottomless pit. Valerie had everything she needed to live a comfortable life, but her insatiable desire for more led her to destroy her inheritance and her relationships. If you allow greed to control your decisions, it will eventually consume you and everyone you claim to love, leaving you with